Welcome back to Worn Out Racing and part 2 of my how to turbocharge your Fiat Cinquecento and Seicento. And this is where it really starts to get interesting. That's right, in the last episode we went over what engine options are available to you, at least the most sensible ones to start with, just to help try and build some knowledge and help hopefully build some sort of direction for your project, or not, depending on how it goes, because it's important to note that this video is absolutely not trying to convince you to turbocharge your car, because there are other routes that you could take, but it's hopefully going to try and help you decide whether it's a good idea or not. And in today's episode, we're going to be getting into the real nitty gritty. So this is going to be getting your engine ready for boost. So that's going to be lowering compression and anything else you need to know. Fuel and upgrades of what you can and should do, and fuel management. So it's going to be going on to the management side of things as well. So stick around and let's get into the good stuff. There's one thing I do need to touch on from the previous episode, and it is a little bit of an apology. So from now on, or at least in this episode, when I start talking about the Tjet engine, the 1.4 16 valve Tjet, it is going to be quite light touch from this point anyway, purely because there's not quite so much to cover with it, with some of the aspects of what I'm going to be going through. But also, like I said before, it's not really my forte. It's not something I know a huge amount about, so I don't want to tell you the wrong information. And I already kind of did a little bit. So just really quickly, on the gearbox front, I said you could use a Fiat 500 gearbox in your Tjet conversion in your Cinquecento with new drive shafts and a few little tweaks. Now, I wasn't a million miles off, that is true. You would need new drive shafts, and a couple of other tweaks I knew about I was going to mention in this video. One of them being that it's a hydraulic clutch in one of those, so you can't use the cable clutch, and you need to obviously switch over to a hydraulic pedal, which is, in itself a little bit of a task. They don't have cable speedo, so it's an electronic readout, usually from the gearbox sometimes, or it actually can be from somewhere else in the actual car as well. So that's something else that you would have to combat. The other thing is, well, they come with a dual mass flywheel, I've been informed, which I didn't know about, and I didn't know this either, is the actual gearbox unit itself is actually a little bit bigger, even though fundamentally all the mounting points and stuff are the same. But what that does mean is the rear gearbox mount and the front gearbox mount really don't line up, so you do have to actually get new gearbox mounters made. And obviously, when you take all that into account, it doesn't seem like quite such a good idea, especially when you consider you can use a Cinquecento box, one of the ones I've already mentioned, and obviously if you pick one of the slightly stronger ones, you should be all right. And all you need to do is swap it over to a Cinquecento friendly flywheel, so which I will get into at some point, which ones you can use, because there are some slightly bigger ones out of the Fiat range that you can nick, and some slight mods to the bolts, and then it bolts straight up. You can use all your original gearbox mounts, and it should be strong enough. So after that little public service announcement, I will apologise, but like I said, I'm all learning the same as you are for some of this stuff, not so much with the 8 valves, because I think I've got that covered, but it's the same thing in the last episode. I'm going to take each engine as it goes, explain what needs to be going before I move on to the next one. And first up, the baby of the group, the 900cc pushrod. Now, one thing I am going to come straight out and explain here is when I say getting your engine ready for boost, and this will be the same for all of them, it's basically lowering the compression, or at least making sure the compression of your engine is at a safe amount to be able to turbo it. Now, anybody who doesn't know what compression ratio is, it's actually relatively easy to explain, but not quite so easy to kind of work out and calculate and figure out what's the best for your engine. Now, the compression is really very much just how big your cylinder space goes from and to, so effectively how much air it fills, and then how much it compresses it. So from its biggest point to its smallest point, how much does it compress the air? You have to kind of think of it like filling up a balloon. If you only put a small amount of air in there, that air isn't very compressed. If you fill it with a lot of air, it's a lot more compressed. And obviously, the more compressed it is, the bigger boom you get. Hence, why being a turbo is a good idea, and why naturally aspirated engines tend to go with higher compression. Now, it does give you a problem when you get to a certain point, because often if you cram too much air and fuel, so when it sucks all the piston all the way out, if you cram way too much air and fuel in there, which you will do with a turbo, when it actually compresses, rather than just compressing it nice and tight ready for the next time it explodes, it will actually ignite too early. It will literally set fire way sooner than you want, which is bad when you're relying on a real close series of events in your engine to take place. At best, it's going to make it run like a pig. At worst, it's going to blow a hole inside your piston, which I think anyone can guarantee you is not a good thing. What I will say, though, is in a lot of modern cars, they do use quite high compression engines. With all modern technology, with the engine systems and management, the actual strength of parts and stuff, they can get away with quite a high compression. But what we're going to do is go for arguably a little bit more of an old school frame of thought, go on the safe side and have a lower compression. And if nothing else, obviously that means then you can run a little bit more boost just to kind of take advantage of it if you need to. So yes, I am aware that it doesn't necessarily have to have a low compression, but we're trying to be safe here, people. Okay, I thought I'd flip the camera around for this one. I'll actually show you. So this is a 900cc. Like I said to you before, I mean, if you've seen one of these or you haven't, it's an engine. It's not a huge amount to talk about for the engine itself, but it does have a few little quirks, I guess. And one of those is being it's actually got quite a low compression. And I guess even though it is a simple engine, that's part of the reason why it's got quite a low power. So they're 39 horsepower out of the factory. My one's got a little bit more. Some of that is because of the fact that it does have that low compression. But this is good because this means that actually for a low boost turbo setup, you could probably get away with that as is. It's about 8-to-1 compression. Now you'll get a lot of, I think even a Tjet runs about 9-to-1 compression. I said it's a more modern engine, so it can kind of get away with it. So I would argue that if you're going to be doing one of these anyway, and I think I sort of mentioned this before, there probably isn't any reason to go for like a high boost setup on one of these anyway, because it's just probably not going to be able to take it. So if you're looking at a low boost setup anyway, I reckon you could probably leave it just as it is and then run sort of like a safe 4 to 6 psi. And to be honest with you, it might even be more than that. Like I said to you before, I've got a build series coming up on one of these soon. And I'm going to be pushing the engine a little bit at least because I think the supercharger that I've got is going to want to run more than 4 to 6 psi anyway. But I would say that, just as an example, I can't see there be any reason why you couldn't run that kind of power. But it does depend on a few other factors. Now, one of the problems with this engine, or I should say one of the limitations, is on the inlet. So if you take this off, anyone who's ever seen another engine before in your life knows that this is a slightly unusual setup because normally you will have obviously 4 inlets into your actual head itself, which obviously means you can get a lot more air in it. And when you come to turbo in it, it's not such a big problem. But this has only got one small opening that goes down through the actual rocker itself. So there's actually a pipe that runs all the way down to there, straight into the head. Now, there are some more modern engines that have the inlet as part of the head, but obviously that's normally split one into each. Now, this hole at the moment, I believe the biggest it is in there is 32 millimeters. So I've actually increased the size of my throttle body. So I think the original one's 30 mil. I've put a 32 mil one on from a Punto 60. You can still get them. But say you slap a 38 mil throttle body on it from something else like the Punto 75, it makes literally no difference whatsoever because it's only got a 32 mil hole to go through. Now, I have seen some of the Trofeo builds, like the rally style engines, where they bore these out to about 34 mil. But I mean, this wall isn't particularly thick, so there's only so much you can go. So again, a low boost setup just makes sense because if you're trying to like throw a load of boost through this, this is going to be your bottleneck here. So there's not really much point doing it. I would say as an engine, it is actually pretty strong. Now I've looked at the pistons; they are quite small. They're not particularly thick pistons and rods. But again, I actually think it would handle it quite well. Now the only slight concern with this engine that's been picked out to me, and I have actually took the sump off to take a look at it, is the crank on most engines. I would say, any I've normally ever seen, have got 4 supports. So they've got bearings in 4 places holding the crank. Now this one's actually only bolted down in 3 places. I've never necessarily heard of one failing. Again, the kind of boost that you're probably going to be running on this, I don't see it being a problem. Some of the Trofeo engines, they said the 900cc's they use in like rallying and stuff in Italy, they can be running anywhere between like 70, 80 horsepower, sometimes even more from this engine. And I appreciate naturally aspirated is a little bit different to boosted, but I don't see that being a massive problem. Compression wise and getting it ready for boost, I think you're probably going to be all right leaving it as it is and stock. So nice and cheap. Now obviously there will be loads of other stuff to cover from that, but that's in the rest of the video. So for now, I'm going to leave it as it is and I'm going to go touch on the other engines. Okay, you wouldn't think it, but there's actually a little bit more of a difference between the 1.1 and the 1.2 as far as getting it ready for boost. At least its options being able to lower your compression. Now in the 1.1, you are a little bit limited. So by that I mean they're usually, say with things like Hondas and Fords, you can usually steal some parts out of the Honda and Ford parts bin, stick them into one of their engines, and you can lower up the compression. Now for the 899, that's the same situation, but for the same for the 1100, I don't know at least of any other Fiat parts that you can bolt in there to lower the compression. So that just leaves you 2 options. One of those, the most expensive option, is forged pistons and rods. They are available. You can get them from, I believe, it's a company in Italy. I'm sure there's some companies in Poland and stuff that can do it as well. But you're looking at paying somewhere between £750 to £800 for a set of them. And that's a big expense when you consider the rest of the stuff that you need to buy. Obviously, if you've got the budget, wicked. But obviously, it does mean you need to pull your engine out, completely strip it down, and fit those pistons and rods. The other option, and this is much further down the budget, but actually it's probably more appealing for most people that are going to be doing a turbo conversion, is a decompression plate. Now, if you need to know what a decompression plate is, I'm just going to grab a head gasket and I'll show you the concept of it. Now, okay, this is actually a head gasket from a 900cc, but I had one kicking about. Now, effectively, what a decompression plate is almost an exact replica of this, but made out of thicker steel. So what it does, it fits between your block and your head, and effectively all it does is just lifts your head a little bit off your block, just making that sort of size or volume of your cylinders just that little bit more. We're not talking loads, but it's enough. So effectively then, when your engine is compressed, it's compressing that air that little bit more, and it's basically giving you the space then to cram more air and fuel into your engine. Now, the good thing about decompression plates is, one, they're not massively expensive. I mean, in theory, anywhere, any good engineering place that's got some CNC machining and stuff, you could take one of these as a template, they could cut you one out. There's not really any shops I know of or any companies that you can buy one directly from. But again, don't let that hold you back. The other good thing about it is you only have to take the cylinder head off your engine. Now, on one of these 8 valves, it's actually a really easy job. It doesn't take a massive amount of time, especially when you've done it as many times as I have. But it's actually not a huge job at all. The only thing that I can't help you with, and I can't give you the exact answer for, is how thick to go. Because obviously the thicker you do it, the bigger it's lower, or the more it's lower in your compression. But obviously it's only so big you can get before it starts to cause problems. So that does take a little bit of research, a little bit of maths, but I'm sure you'll probably be able to find someone who's either used one before or has got some sort of experience with it. Now, they do come with a limitation. Now, you will hear different things about this, but I would say on a decompression plate, you can probably run somewhere between 6 to 8 psi safely before you start to run in any sort of weaknesses and stuff like that. I've known people run 10 psi on them for a while without any real problems. So it's more down to you if you want to push your luck. But 6 to 8 psi on a decent setup on the 1100 or the 1200 will actually give you some decent power, especially if you're going for either the single point injection or the multi point injection. Obviously, unlike the 900cc, you've got a more traditional inlet on there. So actually making a bigger throttle body for it, not such a problem. You can bore out the actual inlet itself. I said you can fit, even Fiats from standard, you can get up to a 38 mil. But there are a few people that actually will make them bigger. Obviously, any company can do it, I suppose, if they actually have got experience. There's somebody, I believe, called Sparky on one of the Fiat groups. And you can go up to sort of, I think, 40 to 42 mil on a standard throttle body. But again, this is getting a little bit further down the line. But what it does mean is you're not too limited when it comes to sort of throwing a bit more boost through it. Now, the only difference is it's going to be on the 1.2, which we'll touch on now. Now, the 1.2, everything I've just said is exactly the same. So you can get forged pistons and rods. They're about £800. And again, you can probably run a similar kind of boost on those as you would with anything. They'll have specs for that online. Obviously, depending on what ones you get, it's how much you can run. Now, decompression plate, exactly the same. In fact, it will almost be exactly the same setup and everything. I don't think the head gaskets are really that much different. So again, you'd expect to probably pay somewhere between, I've seen them being sold for £70. I've seen people trying to sell them for 140, but that's still pretty cheap. So yeah, the price for decompression plate is good. But unlike the 1.1, there is actually another option. That's what I've gone for on mine. So I'm actually going to grab the box and I'll show you, and then I'll explain a little bit more. Okay, good news for anybody thinking about going to a 1.2, which is obviously pretty tempting anyway, because obviously you get more CC from the 1.2, so you get a little bit more power. But the other good thing about it is you can actually take the pistons from the 1.2 16 valve, so again, Mark 1, Mark 2 Fiat Puntos, and they actually will lower your compression. Now, if you've ever seen a piston in a Cinquecento, which I suppose most people wouldn't have done unless something terrible's happened, they're actually pretty flat pistons. So again, when it's sucking all that air down and pressing it, it's really, really flat. Now on the 16 valves, hopefully you can see this, they're actually really dished from the factory. So this is actually having the exact same effect that you get from a decompression plate, where it's actually increasing the volume of your cylinders. But obviously this way, it's a little bit more legit and a little bit more kind of using engineering rather than, I suppose it's not a bodge, a decompression plate, but it kind of is a little bit. Now you can pick these up pretty cheap. Now I actually only paid about £50, I think, for the actual pistons and rods. I'll be honest, I haven't actually checked that these are the 8 valve rods, but use the 8 valve rod and the 16 valve piston top. But I would probably say you really wouldn't want to be spending more than about £100 on them at the moment. It is obviously going to get more expensive the harder it is to find 16 valves. I'll be honest, I can't remember the last time I actually looked up the prices of 16 valve engines, but I imagine there's actually quite a few of them still kicking about. You can also run really good boost on these. My friend Chris had a turbo Cinquecento a few years ago. He said he was running between 20 and 25 psi on a 1200 block with these pistons and stuff in it. And he had quite a simple kind of fueling setup and everything on, and he had no problems for the few years he was running it. I would probably say if you want to err on the side of caution, probably keep that nearer to kind of 14 to 16 psi, and you'll have no problems whatsoever, I shouldn't imagine. It obviously does have the disadvantage, obviously, to get these in your engine, you've got to pull your engine out, but that is not such a bad thing. I did make the mistake of trying to cut corners a little bit. I did get this engine with 16 valve pistons in it already. I gave it the old eyeball check and put it in there, and in the end, that was the worst thing I could have done because it actually did need a bit of a rebuild. So obviously, once you've got it apart, especially if you're converting from a 1.1 to a 1.2, you can strip it down, fit your new pistons and rings, pour new bearings and stuff in it, and you know you're good to go. Other than that, there really is no difference between the 1.1 and the 1.2 getting it ready for boost. Again, there's a whole host of other things we need to cover, but that is enough for now. So on to the last one, which apparently I don't know too much about, is the 1.4 Tjet. And this one's going to be easy, actually. Nothing. It's a T-Jet. It's already ready for boost. You haven't got to do jack. That's it. In all seriousness, the correct answer to that is they're absolutely ready. They come straight out of the factory, already partly forged at the bottom end. Obviously, the pistons can take a load of power. People run sort of 240, 250 horsepower on a bottom end. That is more than enough power in a Cinquecento or a Seicento, and I'm imagining anyone who's thinking of dropping one in their car probably isn't going to go too nuts. There's a load of companies out there that are pushing more power. I think GTT Tuning can do it. They do upgraded pistons, upgraded turbos, upgraded manifolds, but obviously you start getting into mad money. So for the purpose of this, I'm just going to say you haven't got to do jack. Just drop it in and you're done. Right, next big topic is fueling. And arguably, fueling and management is going to be the biggest part or biggest problem, I should say, when it comes to doing your turbo conversion. Getting this bit right basically just makes sure that everything else works. You can have the best pistons, best turbos, the sweetest built engine ever, but if you can't get the fueling right or get enough of it or get too much of it, you're going to run into massive problems. And if you can't control it properly and keep an eye on what's going on, it's going to melt everything in a split second. So I would say this is probably the one area that I probably put the most effort into and probably made the most mistakes. It's probably cost me the most amount of money, and the one area that hopefully I know enough about that will really, really help try and guide you on this. So first up, I'm going to go on fuel pumps, just because, if I'm honest, it's the simplest part. Now, obviously, I'm assuming we've got to this point. I don't need to explain about fuel pumps and everything and what they do, etc., etc. So what I will say is that if you've got a Cinquecento and your turbo in it, I'm going to go as far as say you almost certainly will need to upgrade it. The single point injection that came in the Cinquecento didn't really have a massively high flow in fuel pump. Thankfully, the good news about that is they're actually a really sort of bog standard universal size. It's not a massive problem taking it out. I would say I can do one in about half an hour now. So if you've never done it before, allow an hour and a half or something just to make sure you don't mess it up. Otherwise, it's a nice, easy swap. Now, just to give you an example, this one is from a Fiat Coupe Turbo, or at least it's probably Fiat Coupe Turbo. It's a knockoff one. It's about £25. This would support anything up to 250, 280 horsepower, something like that. It's not particularly expensive, and obviously if you blow one, it's nice and easy. But if you drop one in your fuel tank, it will give you all the fueling you'll ever need in your life. And that goes for all of the conversions I've just told you about, whether you're going for a T-Jet, the 1.2, the 1.1, single point injection, multi-point injection, or all 900cc. I would say you chuck one of those in straight away and then know you've got more than enough fuel. The one warning I would say is don't go nuts. Don't throw some crazy 400 litre per hour fuel pump in there, because you can almost get the same problem then, or the opposite problem, in that it's obviously trying to flow all this fuel, your engine doesn't need it, and it can overheat and burn out. So just try and keep it sensible. I mean, worst case scenario is you buy one that's not quite up to the task. You'll find out eventually when you go for mapping, because obviously you'll run out of fuel and it will limit the amount of power that you can make. So don't make that mistake. Upgrade it when you can. Job done. Okay, the next part of the fueling is obviously the fuel injectors. Now, this is where I'm going to try and cover off. I'm not even going to touch the T-Jet, because I'm going to say that's all sorted. And it's got the fuel injectors, the fuel rail, and everything to handle boost, nothing to mention. But on the 900, the 1.1, and the 1.2, this is all encompassing. So everything I'm about to tell you now is the same. So if you're running a single point injection, this one, you have got little to no scope at all of making that injector any bigger. I have heard things where people have managed to find something that's slightly larger, but for a turbo application, it's going to make least a bit difference at all. So what that basically means is you need to add more injectors to your system. Now, I will show you my car, but I'll actually give you a quick demonstration in front of the camera now. What effectively you're using is on a 900cc, they come with one of these. It's called a throttle body bob. It sits on top of the throttle body and it sucks air from the side. And what you're effectively doing is stealing this idea and making it better, which I will show you in a second. And what you use is actually this to then mount another injector into the side of it. Effectively, just add in twice as much fuel whenever you need it. We'll get into the management of that in a second, but I'll just quickly show it on my car so you can see what I mean. Okay, here it is. I say it's a 1.2, but that doesn't matter for the time being. Now you can see here, this is effectively now just a much larger, much stronger version of the throttle body bob I just showed you. Now my one's obviously multi-point injection, so I don't need to have the additional injector in the side, but obviously you can spec it out however you want. I wired my dump valve towards the front. I knew what size inlet pipes and stuff I wanted, but you have a throttle body, but you have an injector bung here. They're about £20 for a wound-on aluminium bung. I got this made by a company called Crafty Metal. His name is Rob Ledbetter. He's part of one of the groups and stuff. I probably will stick his company details in the link and description. I think he does do a few automotive things when he gets the time. I paid about £50 for this. So really you're looking at about £70 probably all in to get this throttle body made up. And that does mean then you can add the amount of injectors that you want. Obviously, I've never seen anybody add more than one additional one, especially not on the 900, because you're just not going to need that kind of fuel in. And I would even say on the 1.1 single point injection, one more injector will be more than enough for most of your needs. Now the good news about that, adding that one extra injector, is actually you don't even have to go mad. Now this is a set from a Mark II Punto. Again, these are 147cc, which is I think way bigger than the one that's already in there. So you could probably just nick one of these. I'll be honest, you can pretty much use anything without going completely nuts. You don't want anything too big, because obviously you start getting into like spray patterns and stuff like that. You don't need anything crazy. Which I will explain in one of our budget fuel management sections in a little bit. Now, the only difference is, for the multi-point injection, obviously, you've already got 4 injectors, so you don't need to add any more, but you might need to upgrade them. In fact, I would probably go as far to say it makes sense to upgrade them anyway. Now, I've got Alpha 156 injectors. It's a really common size injector on these anyway, so you can go for things like 106 GTI, Ford sport cars. You go Fiat Coupe Turbo if you're running something a little bit more crazy. But in truth, just get some good injectors. Don't cost you an absolute fortune. But bear in mind, if you do buy them second-hand, allow some money to get them sent away for flow testing and to have them cleaned. Now, that isn't actually that cheap. So if you do get second-hand ones, either be willing to take the risk that they're decent, or weigh up the pros and cons of buying a brand new set. Especially if you're going for like the single injector that you're adding, it probably wouldn't hurt just to buy one brand new one. Other than that, it's actually pretty easy. You pull the fuel rails off. Sometimes you need to add some little spaces if the injectors are a little bit longer, but otherwise actually upgrading the fuel in as far as the pump and the injectors is a doddle and actually shouldn't cost very much. Now my Alpha injectors cost me £40 I think for all 4 injectors and the fuel rail, which I've still got kicking about. You probably expect to pay anywhere between that and 100 I'd say for a second-hand set, depending if you go for like Fiat Coupe ones. So that's the fuel pump and the fuel injectors. Now the only other thing that you need to do in your fuel system as far as the actual like hardware side of things is a fuel pressure regulator. So anybody doesn't know what a fuel pressure regulator is, it does exactly that. It regulates your fuel. So your fuel pump will pump as much fuel as it can through your system, but it'll only ever be under so much pressure. If you think of it like you have a hose pipe, you turn it on, the water trickles out, but the more you put your finger over the end, the higher pressure that comes out. And that's pretty much what a fuel pressure regulator does. It sits after your injectors and it sort of stops that fuel just flowing straight past everything and not getting much pressure in it. Now, every car's got one, some way or another, but they're nearly always like fixed. It'll just have a fixed fuel pressure for a non-turbo car, just to make sure that it just gets consistent pressure the whole time. Now, on a turbo car, and this is on even from the factory and stuff, that will be a rising rate. So as the turbo makes boost, as it gets more like pressure in the inlet and stuff, the fuel pressure goes up. Now the science behind that is because now you're stuffing loads of air into the same area that essentially those fuel injectors are trying to squirt fuel. The more pressure from air you get, the more it's trying to push that fuel back out of the cylinders. So obviously, if you didn't put a rising rate fuel pressure regulator on it, as soon as you get your pressure builds up a lot, your fuel just can't physically get into your engine. So what you do is, I'll show you on my car now actually, just to make it a little bit easier to explain it. Right, now these aren't massively expensive. I think I paid about £70 for this. There's loads of different sorts. This is a Cyvec one. But what it does is you get this boost pipe, which just comes like the same one I've got that goes to my dump valve. I've got one that goes to my boost gauge. And it just gives this a boost reading. And as the boost increases, it just does like a one-to-one increase. So as the boost goes up 5 psi, this goes up 5 psi. Like it just does it enough so that as your boost increases, your fuel pressure goes up. And this one's adjustable. So you can set it at whatever its starting point is. So I know on mine I'm doing it to about 2.5 bar. Just go with the research basically just suggested that was probably best for my engine. And as you'll see there, look, this is where the fuel comes from the fuel rail, and then it goes down to return to the tank. And like I said, this is effectively, as you're undoing this and doing this up, it's just restricting that fuel more or less. And it comes with a gauge, so you can keep an eye on it. So a lot of my problems I've had have been down to fuel flow, and this has helped me identify, because you can see whenever we started building boost, my fuel pressure was dropping massively. And in my case, at least, it was because I wasn't getting the fuel flow I needed because my fuel fills were clogged. So it's definitely a worthwhile thing having anyway, having a fuel pressure gauge. But definitely allow for that. Like I said, about £70, you can go again up to maybe a couple £100 if you go for like a crazy one. But I've had these on a Turbo Mini and they are sweet. But other than that, hardware-wise, that's all you need. You know what they say, power is nothing without control. So you've got all this fuel, all your extra injectors, you know what engine you've got, you've lowered your compression, but then what are you going to do with it? You need to control it. So that's what we're going to touch on next. And this is the one that gets a little bit more confusing.